Upper Hudson Peace Action is pleased to present Dr. Michael Klare speaking on the new Cold War with China. Can we prevent it from going hot? And Dr. Larry Whitner will introduce Dr. Klare.
Thank you very much, Bob. Welcome to this event. It's a great pleasure to introduce the featured speaker tonight, Dr. Michael Klare. Michael has had a long and very productive career as a researcher, teacher, and writer in the areas of peace and world security. During the 1960s and 1970s, he did groundbreaking research on U.S. arms sales to Latin American nations. During the 1970s, he also served as the director of the Militarism and Disarmament Project of the Institute for Policy Studies. He went on to become a five-college professor of peace and world security studies and director of the five-college program in peace and world security studies. Since his retirement, he's become a senior visiting fellow at the Arms Control Association in Washington, D.C., and the Defense Correspondent of The Nation magazine. His 15 books include, most recently, The Race for What's Left, a chilling analysis of the global scramble for dwindling resources, and All Hell Breaking Loose, the Pentagon's perspective on climate change. He has also written a vast number of articles which have appeared in such publications as Arms Control Today, Foreign Affairs, Harper's, Scientific American, and The Nation. There are many writers on world affairs, but a key reason that Michael is among most respected is that his powerful analyses are backed up by the facts. Unlike many writers, he's able to plow through an avalanche of government documents, corporate reports, and scientific studies to discover the truth about what's going on in our world and then bring it to us in a very readable form. After his talk, which will last about 40 minutes, there will be time for you to direct questions to Michael. You should place those questions in the chat section of this Zoom call. We will attempt to get to as many of them as possible. But for now, let's listen to our speaker, Michael Klare.
Well, hello, everybody. And thank you, Larry, for that kind introduction. And thanks, Bob, and your colleagues for putting this together. And thanks, everybody, for joining in tonight. I want to say I think this is a terribly important topic, and I hope you will benefit from what I have to say. I hope you'll listen critically to what I have to say and provide a lot of feedback. I'm going to provide a slideshow for this evening. This is an attempt to bring all the dimensions of this topic together in one presentation. I want to say that I do hope to use this presentation in future events like this because I think the topic is so important, and I believe that education around this topic is critically important, as I'll argue. So your feedback will be much appreciated as I go through this. I'm using slides because some of the topics involve geography, and I want to point out the geography a bit. And I'm also going to throw up on the screen some quotations from Chinese leaders and American leaders that I think provide a sense of the flavor of the moment that we're in. So I'm now going to proceed and put up the slides. So give me 1 second here as I move to operationalize this. And we're going to make this, there we go. And if you are able to and can minimize the viewing part of your screen so you could see the whole thing. I encourage you to do that so you don't miss anything, but ask me later if you have any questions. So I begin here with a quotation. I hope you can read it from former Australian Prime Minister Kevin Rudd that appeared in Foreign Affairs this summer, in which he said, "We're confronting the prospect not just of a new Cold War, but of a hot war as well." And that's the theme of my presentation tonight. And are we headed to a hot war? Why and how that might break out and how we might prevent it. So my topic is broken down into three parts. The new Cold War with China and what that's composed of. Secondly, how the Cold War could explode into a hot war. And third, how we could resist the new Cold War from going hot. So the first part is new Cold War with China. And I say that we're in a new Cold War with China because it has multiple dimensions on both sides, and I'm going to discuss all of these elements. So to begin with, I say that there is on both sides an overall strategic framework to the Cold War. This is not just a collection of disparate policies and trends. It's viewed on both sides as an all-consuming struggle. And I begin with a paragraph from a bill that was introduced this month by Senators Robert Menendez of New Jersey and James Risch of Idaho, a Democrat and a Republican. And I emphasize the bipartisan nature of this. We're going to come back to this bill, the Strategic Competition Act of 2021, and you could read it. But I'll say, the essence is the sense of Congress that the president must lead and direct the entire executive branch to make the People's Republic of China the greatest geopolitical and geoeconomic challenge for United States foreign policy, and that every part of foreign policy must be allocated to addressing that challenge. So there's a sense that we're now in a all-consuming struggle with China.
Well, I don't know why you're having this problem.
And there is also an ideological dimension to this. That is to say, on both sides, a perception is not just a competition, a rivalry, but something that goes beyond that. Much as was the case during the original Cold War between the US and the Soviet Union, when it was the free world against the communist menace. And here I quote from Secretary of State Antony Blinken in the summit meeting he had with his Chinese counterpart, Yang Jiechi, the director of the Foreign Affairs Commission Office of the Chinese Communist Party in Anchorage in March, in which he makes very clear that there's a sharp distinction between what he calls the rules-based order of the West, the new term for the free world, in which, as opposed to how they view the Chinese ruled world, one in which might makes right and winners take all, and that would be a more violent and unstable world. So there's a perception of this sharp break. And here you have the Chinese response. This was his counterpart, Yang Jiechi, making very clear that from the Chinese position that China sees that there is also a sharp ideological dimension in this struggle between China and the United States, and he takes very sharp distinction and between him and it takes no nonsense from Blinken. I hope you can read this. So you get I want you to get a sense of for the thinking and the language, how the two sides view each other as being engaged in this struggle. This struggle is accompanied by a intensifying military competition. The US and China each see each other as their principal military opponent, and that they must build up their military capabilities to counter each other. And this is creating a spiraling one side has to match the other in a continuing spiral of arms buildup and arms acquisition. So in the Biden request for defense spending in fiscal year 2020, a $715 billion request says very clearly that the budget prioritizes the need to counter the threat from China as the Department of Defense's top challenge, and that the United States will do whatever it takes to overpower China. And in that defense budget, this is the Biden budget, mind you, the request prioritizes two areas for future military spending. One is a naval buildup to counter Chinese Navy in the Western Pacific. And another is specifically on long-range missiles to allow the United States to attack Chinese assets on the mainland, specifically hypersonic missiles. And I'll talk more about that. China is also responding by increasing its military spending. This year to, they say, $209 billion, considerably less than the United States, although some analysts believe that the actual figure is higher than $209 billion. When you count in their Coast Guard, which behaves in an aggressive fashion, and research and development and so on, but nonetheless, considerably less than the United States. But like the US, China is investing a large part of its defense budget on naval modernization, naval expansion, and the acquisition of missiles intended for attacks on US warships in the Pacific. Also part of this Cold War behavior is what I call diplomatic maneuvering and alliance building. Both sides are engaging in intense diplomatic maneuvering to line up allies for their competitive struggle with each other. And once again, we're looking at something very similar to the original Cold War between the US and the Soviet Union. For the US side, this often involves what's being called the Quad, the alliance between the US, Australia, India, and Japan. And for many US strategists, this is being viewed as a proto-NATO for Asia to contain China. And you can imagine how the Chinese view this as an obvious threat to their security and their future. And I have to say that the Biden administration has eagerly embraced the Quad. This began under the Trump administration, but has gained momentum under Biden. This is one of his primary foreign policy measures, is to build up the Quad against China. By the way, in everything I say, I'm going to emphasize developments that have occurred since President Biden took office. A lot of this began under Trump, but we have seen it all accelerate in the Biden administration. There's much that we may admire in what President Biden is doing in other areas, but in this area, there's much that I find deeply troubling. Now, for China, the primary vehicle it's using to build up its alliances is what's called the Belt and Road Initiative, which is a $1 trillion infrastructure scheme to build up highways, railroads, shipping routes, transmission lines to link the economies of Asia, Africa, and Europe to China, and create an alternative to the Western US-dominated economic system. So along with those other elements of the Cold War is economic competition and what's called decoupling. Once again, a lot of this began under President Trump. The stiff tariffs on Chinese exports to this country, various impediments to Chinese investments in the United States, barriers to Chinese access to American technology, and also what's being called decoupling, or the severing of supply links that connect the US and China. And this is going to have the long-term effect of dividing the world's economy into two separate spheres, one centered on China and one on the United States. Many economists believe that the ultimate effect of this will be to slow economic growth for everyone. I want to emphasize for a minute another aspect of all of this, and that is the revival of Cold War paranoia and intolerance of dissent. And some of you who are listening tonight may well remember the Cold War period and McCarthyism, and we're beginning to see elements of that in this country. The same thing in China. Chinese authorities are using the heightening of American hostility towards China. That is to say, the Chinese authorities are claiming that American pressure against China is the justification for a crackdown on dissent, especially in Hong Kong, but also in the far western province of Xinjiang, where Uyghur Muslims have been severely repressed by the Chinese authorities. But they're now claiming that in the interests of national unity, China cannot tolerate dissent. But in this country as well, we are seeing elements of this Cold War paranoia. There's been a huge increase in violence against Asian Americans, wherever they came from, China or not, and also a increase in repression against, or restrictions against, discrimination against Chinese American scholars and scientists in academia. Anyone with ties, anyone who has received grants or has other ties with Chinese institutions is under scrutiny. Some have lost their visas. Some have lost their positions. And as you could see under the Menendez bill, the proposed bill under Section 4, you could see the kind of language they're talking about, that the US has to increase vigilance to the risks posed by the undue influence of the Chinese Communist Party in the United States. And this is exactly the kind of language that was used in the 1950s to force members of the Communist Party out of academia in the United States. So this is part of what happens in a Cold War environment, and we're seeing more and more of that in this country, and of course in China as well. So now let me turn to the second part of my presentation. From Cold War to hot, how would this occur? Cold wars always have a risk of morphing into hot wars. During the original Cold War, there were several occasions when that almost occurred. And there were also near accidental escalation events. And I worry about those now as well. So what are the factors that could lead to a hot war breaking out? Incompatible national visions, conflictive geographies, alliance entanglements, and risky military doctrines. And I'll talk about each of those in turn. First, what do I mean by incompatible national visions? And please feel free to challenge me about this later, but I feel, and I think you could see that at the national level in both countries, there is a perception that the other is posing a existential threat that must be resisted. The Chinese leadership, and I think most of the Chinese population, believes that China has overcome centuries of underdevelopment and weakness and imperial rule to finally attain the status of a major world power, and that therefore it deserves to play an equal role in world affairs with the United States. And China, therefore, the Chinese people resent the fact that the United States continues to dominate the Western Pacific, which is their front yard. On the US side, the US leadership, and I believe most of the population, believe that the US rightfully commands its paramount role in world affairs, and that its values are largely shared by the rest of the world. And they view China as posing an unacceptable threat to America's rightful paramountcy, and considers China's pursuit of regional security in Asia as a threat to vital US national interests. If this is true, these are incompatible national visions that underlie the military drive I've been talking about. So you could see this is, I just want to give you a taste of how each side views things. This was a speech given a few days ago by Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yis to the US Council on Foreign Relations, expressing the confidence that China now feels, having leveled, as he say, leveled up the 1.4 billion Chinese people from poverty and backwardness to relative prosperity. And that China's socialist democracy is representative, embodies the will of the people, fits the country's realities, and is endorsed by the people. And I think that probably is shared by most people in China, not certainly people in Tibet and Xinjiang and elsewhere, but a large majority, I believe. And this is President Biden's interim national security, expressing this notion that the United States must prevail in strategic competition with China by restoring US credibility and reasserting forward-looking global leadership. We will ensure that America, not China, sets the international agenda. These are the expressions of these competing national identities. Now I want to talk about conflictive geographies as another factor. Many, if not most of the dangers of a US-China war arise from the geographical realities of contending US and Chinese strategic interests in the Western Pacific. And they principally revolve around three areas of contention. Going from the north, the first is the Senkaku Diaoyu Islands. These are small uninhabited islands. Closest big place is Okinawa, which has a large American military bases, the largest in the Pacific right here, not so far from Taiwan and China. These islands are claimed by China and also by Japan. Then, of course, there's Taiwan itself, and then the South China Sea with the islands within them. And I'm going to talk about these one by one in a minute. But first, I want to come back for a minute to these conflictive national visions, why these areas matter so much. And that is a historical reality. The United States became a Pacific power in 1898 when it seized the Philippines after defeating Spain in the Spanish-American War. And since 1898, it has been US strategic policy, reaffirmed by one president after another, Democrats and Republicans alike, that America's forward strategic defense line lies to the west of the Philippines, in the South China Sea, the East China Sea, right here off the coast of China, extending from Japan and South Korea down past Taiwan into the South China Sea. That this is America's front line of defense. And nobody has challenged that since 1898. We fought a war in World War II when Japan challenged that notion. We fought a war in Korea over that, and we fought a war in Vietnam, all arising out of this primal notion that this is America's security zone. The problem with this is that China, for China, this is their front line, this is their Caribbean. And for China, China believes that its natural defense line should be what they call the second island chain. The second island chain, which is out here with Guam and the Marianas Islands out here, and that this should not be a U.S. Naval dominated area, that the U.S. should keep its ships out here in the middle Pacific or over there by Hawaii. Now, this is a fundamental difference that if it's not resolved, will result in World War III. And this relates to another point I made about alliance entanglements, which we could discuss in greater length. As a consequence of the US belief that its strategic line of defense lies here to the west of the first island chain, which is the Philippines and Taiwan. It has established defense relationships with Japan, South Korea, the Philippines historically, and has bases in Okinawa and Japan and South Korea, historically with the Philippines, now trying to have those restored. It has a base in Singapore and Australia. There are military relationships with all those countries that tie the US down and pose an obvious threat to Chinese security. Now, let me quickly, I should keep track of our time. Quickly look at the three areas where a war with China could break out. I say World War III because these all have the potential to involve the use of nuclear weapons, and that's what scares me so very much. The three areas are the South China Sea, the East China Sea, and Taiwan. And I'll briefly discuss the issues involved in each of them. The South China Sea is an area bounded by China to the north and Taiwan, by Vietnam to the west, the Philippines to the east, and Malaysia, Brunei, and Indonesia to the south. And it contains a number of uninhabited islands and reefs and atolls. China claims the entire area inside what it calls the 9-dash line, those red dashes, as its national maritime territory on the basis of somewhat dubious historical claims. And therefore it claims all the islands. And to assert its authority, China has expanded those islands by dredging up sand from the bottom of the ocean and built military bases on them. But in 2016, on the basis of a case brought by the Philippines, the International Court of Arbitration in The Hague ruled that China's claims to the South China Sea had no legal basis whatsoever and were illegitimate. To deter claimants from exploiting the fishing and hydrocarbon resources of the islands, so the area, this whole area is believed to be very rich in oil and natural gas. And China and Vietnam have been drilling in that area, the Philippines here, to harass, to prevent those countries from exploiting those resources. China has used its Navy to drive off those ships. And the US has promised to help protect those countries from Chinese harassment and regularly conducts what are called freedom of navigation operations close to the Chinese claimed islands, often provoking a Chinese military response. Now, this has increased since the Biden administration took over. The number of these freedom of navigation operations has been increasing in recent months. There have been one every few weeks where the US ships go right up to those islands. And I'm showing you a picture. I want you to see this. This was from 2018. On the left is a US destroyer. On the right is a Chinese warship. You could see how close they came to each other. The Chinese ships often try to nudge the American ships out of what they claim are Chinese waters. Nobody got hurt in that incident, but it was a close call. And this is the kind of incident that could lead to a shooting incident and an escalatory situation. And both sides, in anticipation of a possible conflict arising in the South China Sea, both sides are regularly conducting major military exercises there. These are happening right now. The aircraft carrier USS Theodore Roosevelt has been there this month. That's on the left, conducting, multi-ship and air operations for a possible war with China in that region. And you could see on the right a fascinating picture. This is American officers on one of the ships in the US fleet looking at the Chinese aircraft carrier conducting operations as well. This is how close they come to each other. This happened in the past week or so. So you could see that the tempo of military operations is increasing under the Biden administration. Next, briefly, but this is dangerous, equally dangerous, or almost as dangerous, is the East China Sea. The East China Sea is bounded by Taiwan to the south, Japan and South Korea to the north, and China to the west. And in it is a bunch of uninhabited islands. They're really big rocks sticking out of the water, as you could see, called the Diaoyu Islands in China and the Senkaku Islands in Japan. They're rich in fishing waters, and both sides send their armed Coast Guard vessels there all the time, and planes, and they come very close to each other, as you could see in this picture, planes as well. The islands are administered by Japan, whatever that means, and the US has reaffirmed on the Biden Japanese administration of the islands and said that it will help defend Japan if it comes under attack from China. So this is another place where an incident could spark a US-Chinese military encounter. And let me finish the three with Taiwan. Some of you know a lot about Taiwan. Some of you may be less familiar. So very quickly, to summarize, China, the government in Beijing, claims that Taiwan is a renegade province of the PRC. At one point, Taiwan was ruled by a competing government of China, ruled by the Chinese Nationalist Party, the Kuomintang, which fled to the island in 1949, the remnants, and called itself the Republic of China, the ROC, which is the name that the government of Taiwan goes by. And increasingly, that government views the island as an independent state, separate from the mainland. And the mainland Chinese government has said any move to declare full independence would be an act of rebellion and justify a Chinese military intervention. When the US established diplomatic relations with the PRC government in 1979, on January 1st, it agreed to sever formal relations with the ROC government in Taipei. But under the Taiwan Relations Act of 1979, the US pledged to maintain informal relations with Taipei, with Taiwan government, to assist in its self-defense. And it made this statement that this is the US law, that any effort to determine the future of Taiwan by other than peaceful means would be considered a threat to the peace and security of the Western Pacific and of grave concern to the United States. Now, clearly that's a very ambiguous statement. It doesn't say the US will come to the defense of Taiwan. It suggests it might. And this is called strategic ambiguity in political discussion in Washington. And in accordance with that hint of possible intervention, the US sends, again, freedom of navigation operations, they're called, in the Taiwan Strait on a regular basis. Once again, these have increased in recent months under the Biden administration. Recently, American officials have called for a more explicit pledge by the US to defend Taiwan in the event of an invasion. This is going to be the #1 toughest issue the Biden administration is going to have to face. They haven't made up their minds yet. but they're under pressure from the Republican Party. And here you have a statement from Tom Cotton of Arkansas, a possible Republican contender for the presidential nomination and the next presidential election, an extreme hawk on China, but reflecting the Republican view that's putting Biden under pressure to replace strategic ambiguity with strategic clarity, that the US will come to the aid to Taiwan if it was attacked by China. And you know, if that were to happen, then we would be in a World War situation. And needless to say, such talk has provoked strong response from the Chinese. Here's a statement from Yang Jiechi when he was meeting with Antony Blinken in Anchorage, making it very clear that they're not going to take not going to allow the US to interfere in Taiwan. So where this is going to head is unclear. What is clear is that both sides are stepping up their military activities in the area in the event that military clash will occur. This is happening now. This is right now. The Chinese have increased their air operations in the air defense zone claimed by Taiwan. And you could see how close Taiwanese planes come to Chinese planes when that occurs. And right now, the Theodore Roosevelt is in the area conducting military drills in waters near Taiwan as a signal to China that if things get out of hand, we're prepared to, you know, go all out. And finally, in discussing why I worry about escalation to a hot war is the military doctrines of the two sides, which, because of this geography, emphasize the early use of weapons that would provoke an escalatory response. On the Chinese side, they fear that any event that if there was an incident, it's going to involve attacks from US aircraft carriers on their forces. So what do you do if that's the case? China's response is to build hundreds of these things, ballistic missiles intended to destroy American aircraft carriers. This is the DF-21 anti-ship ballistic missile, which can be armed with a conventional warhead or a nuclear warhead, and you can't tell the difference. So US doctrine says that in an event of a clash, the first thing we're going to do is to attack all of these and their supporting infrastructure. So you have a situation where a minor incident, like the one I showed you earlier, of two ships colliding, if things start heating up, one side or the other is going to be inclined to destroy the other's major assets. And that leads very rapidly to all-out war and conceivably nuclear weapons use. And I could say much more about nuclear weapons, but you could ask me about that. So let me take a few minutes because this is the important question, is how do we resist the new Cold War and prevent it from getting hot? And let me be honest with you, this is a work in progress. We're all going to have to contribute to this strategic thinking about how to do this. And I'm going to welcome whatever contributions you could make to this. But here are my thoughts. I think it's going to take these kinds of initiatives, becoming more informed about issues, countering the Cold War narratives of those like Tom Cotton who want to get us involved in war, movement building, coalition formation, and pressure on elected officials. So just briefly on each of these, I think most of us, many of us are insufficiently informed about these key issues, and therefore makes it difficult for us to engage in the political process with others who have taken a strong stand and have weaponized topics like human rights in China, and who could talk about Taiwan, the South China Sea, the Senkaku Islands in a very aggressive fashion. And it's therefore essential that we become more knowledgeable about everything that I've been talking about, so that we are able to engage in the political process. And so I encourage all of us to become better informed about these issues. And I will provide some resources here. I think we need more webinars and public events like the ones we're now holding. People should get together and organize educational events like this to become informed. The resources I indicate, the Committee for a Sane U.S.-China Policy that I'm involved in, and the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft, both have webinars that you can watch just by going to those sites. You can see educational webinars. The Quincy Institute has some terrific ones on China issues, and my organization has produced a couple of them. Countering Cold War narratives. The mass media, the political arena is dense with anti-China, pro-Cold War tropes and narratives. And we will not be able to reverse the slide towards a new hot war unless we can address this phenomenon. And this is going to require developing an understanding of the contentious issues like Taiwan, the Uyghurs, and being able to offer sensible, credible responses to the most outlandish and inflammatory claims. And when I say this, and I'm sure you're going to come back to me about it, this does not mean defending China. I do not believe in, have any desire to defend China's despicable behavior in Xinjiang and Hong Kong. But things have to be put in perspective so that we don't go to nuclear war. So we have to be able to address those issues in a reasonable fashion. And we have to find means of doing so in letters to the editor, op-ed articles, participation in debates with those who we disagree with, panel discussions, and so on. You know, and eventually, my friends, we're not gonna be able to halt the slide to a hot war without building a political force that could challenge the pro-war forces in Washington. Our contacts in Washington, in Congress, tell us that the word they use is toxic. There's a toxic environment. You can't speak out and call for reasonable, peaceful cooperation with China without coming under intense attack from Democrats as well as Republicans. There's because there is no outside pressure on Washington to behave in a responsible way. And the only way that's going to change is with grassroots pressure. So we have to have a movement that'll do that. And that's going to require creating such a movement type formation, either by expanding work on China within existing peace and anti-nuclear groups, in groups of faith and so on, or creating new ones devoted to that issue. My colleague Joseph Gerson and I have started an organization called the Committee for a Sane U.S.-China Policy as an attempt to do that, and you're all encouraged to join with us. Coalition formation. We're not, the peace movement are not the only people who have a stake in this. There are others who do, and we need to be in coalition with them. The Asian Americans who are being targeted as a result of this anti-China hysteria. There are business people who do trade with China and who are facing negative consequences. There are academics who are experiencing a new McCarthyism on campus. There are those who want to shift priorities from defense spending to health and poverty reduction and the climate crisis, and they're seeing defense spending going up, and the things they want are not going to be financed. And there are peace groups in the countries that are more directly affected. That'll be in the direct line of fire if a war breaks out. And I will end with this. Eventually, we have to put pressure on our elected officials. And I'm going to highlight two measures where you'll have an opportunity to be writing and calling your members of Congress this spring. One is to oppose Senate Bill S1169. Write that number down, 1169, Senate Bill 1169, the Strategic Competition Act of 2021, which is a bill to spend tens, ultimately hundreds of billions of dollars to create a military system to crush China. That's the essence of it. And it says it's chock full of measures to intend to decrease U.S. military pressure on Taiwan. It should say China, to support Taiwan and increase U.S. military pressure on Taiwan. And so we have to oppose passage in its current form of that bill. It's posing as a bill to improve the U.S. economy, but the essence of the bill is to contain China and prevent its rise, and to build up the U.S. military to do that. And then later this spring, the Biden administration will release its defense budget for 2022, and it's going to include many of those weapons I spoke about: new ships, hypersonic missiles, more nuclear weapons aimed at China. And when that comes out, we could oppose those specifically, and you'll hear about that. And here are some organizations and websites you can go to that are working on these issues. I'll leave this up, but I'll stop now and give you an opportunity to start asking me questions.
Great, Michael. Thank you so much. I just want to make sure you can hear me. I have moved since we started.
I can hear you well.
Okay, perfect. This was fantastic. I'm so used to lectures being history-based that not only were you history-based, you had action items for us all to do. And I think that is really helpful. There's a lot of activists with us today. So that was wonderful. Thank you so much. Well, we already started getting questions. So if you have questions, please put them in the chat. Some of them are quite long. So if you need me to repeat anything, Michael, please let me know.
Okay.
So the first one is from Ben. The Chinese economy is expected to grow bigger than the US economy this decade. How will this affect the overall equation? Diplomatic relations, military, potential war? What would a China-US war look like?
Oh, those are 3 or 4 different questions.
Yeah.
Bear in mind that per capita, even if China's economy is equal to the US, because their population is 5 times greater, the standard of living per capita will be 1/5 that of the United States. So there'll still be relative poverty in China, and there'll be large pockets of poverty in China still. So we have to bear that in mind. How they spend their money will matter. How much of it will go to defense as compared to in the United States. In the United States, we spend a greater percentage of our GNP on military affairs and military appropriations to give us a U.S. military advantage, and I think that matters. So how China will spend its money matters. And how the decoupling of the world's economy proceeds will matter. Will other countries choose to align with the United States economy or with the Chinese economy? And that's going to depend on who offers the better deal. And, you know, China's right now, at this point, China's offering development aid to Asia, Africa, and the United States is not. Through the Belt and Road Initiative. So we'll see. I could, you know, these questions can take the rest of the evening.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I said, what would a war between US and China look like? I did speak about that briefly, but it's going to happen very swiftly with air and missile attacks by the US on China's mainland facilities. Now, grasp this. The war is not going to happen on our shores, on our cities. It's going to be attacks from US aircraft carriers in the Pacific on Chinese military facilities on the mainland. And you can imagine that that's going to spark a fierce Chinese reaction, probably using missiles. They're going to probably would attack Okinawa, where our bases are, bases in Japan, bases in South Korea, and certainly US aircraft carriers. And that's going to lead to a snap escalation spiral. For which I see, I don't know how it's going to be controlled.
Okay, so this is another long one. This one is from Chuck Bell. We can understand why the nativist Trump party and neocons like to bash China to score cheap points with voters. But what's up with the corporatists, pro-WTO, make a deal, centrist wing of the Democrats? Wouldn't economic engagement be more lucrative than fighting?
So this is a very interesting question. And that sector is divided. It's not unified as it once was. There once was a very strong business community lobby in favor of free trade with China. That lobby, that sector is now divided. There are still elements of that community, like the automobile industry, that wants to sell cars in China, and other large economic sectors that want to do trade with China, but others that now want to break ties with China. And that's partly because the Chinese have behaved badly towards them. And this is typical of a developing country, where they have demanded that any investment in China, manufacturing investment, include the sharing of technical know-how. And the Chinese have exploited that to develop their own companies that are now competing with American companies. They're no longer, poor second cousins. They're now able to compete with US companies on the world markets. So American companies now feel burned by some of their experiences in China, and therefore are willing to to support the efforts to limit, to circumscribe the Chinese economy.
This question is from Eleanor Stein. She wants to say hello to you first. How do we anticipate the rapidly growing climate crisis to play a role in these scenarios? I can see war over Arctic resources, but I could also see US and Chinese civil society alliances building to force governments to turn resources from military to climate investments. Do you have any thoughts?
This is the one area where we see some hope. The Biden administration has made climate cooperation with China a priority, and the president's climate envoy, John Kerry, has been sent to met in Shanghai with his Chinese counterpart last week and talked about cooperation with China. And I think there's real possibility there. And China and the US together account for about 45% of the world's carbon emissions. So cooperation between the two of them is absolutely essential if we're ever going to solve the climate crisis. And so I think citizen pressure could make a difference in both countries. The problem here is what I spoke about in my talk, which is the harsh language adopted by the Biden administration, especially Secretary of State Blinken, in his remarks that I cited, of demonizing China. And it's very difficult to U.S. to build ties, positive ties with China for cooperation if we're going to continue to demonize China and engage in China bashing, especially on issues which are primal to them, like Taiwan, and Hong Kong and Xinjiang. And the Chinese have been leaders have been very clear about that. Taiwan, Hong Kong, Xinjiang are internal matters to them, internal affairs. And if you're going to attack us on those issues and divide and assist Taiwan to break away, we're not going to cooperate with you on anything. Get lost. So if climate is going to be a priority, the U.S. has got to adopt a more conciliatory tone on those other issues. It's got to, place a higher priority on the climate. And as Eleanor says, citizen pressure can make a difference.
Mm-hmm. Here's a shorter question, but probably a longer answer. What are the risks and potentials of North Korean military, political, and economic events influencing US-China relations and endangering world peace?
Could you repeat that?
Sure. What are the risks and potentials of North Korean military, political, and economic events influencing US-China relations and endangering peace?
Well, very significant. That's not a long. That's not difficult. But it is complicated in the sense that the U.S. would like China. The U.S. would like China to come in and browbeat the North Koreans into being more conciliatory towards the United States and to agree to denuclearize and so on. The North Koreans are not very, and China has a certain amount of pressure leverage it could extend over North Korea because it's its leading trading partner, economic supporter, ally, and so forth. But China doesn't want to use that leverage, in part because it fears that if the North Korean regime collapses, it will come under the sway of South Korea, and South Korea is an American ally with American forces, and then you'd have American forces right on the Chinese border. And we'll all recall the last time that happened was in 1950, and China intervened in the Korean War, and we all know what happened then. So China doesn't want that to happen, and would prefer to keep North Korea there as a kind of a buffer state. You know, there's a lot more to be said about that. North Korea does pose a serious danger. So if we want to see North Korea reduce the level of threat, the U.S. is going to have to be more engaged in heftier negotiations with the North Koreans. And this is something that President Trump, in his delusional fashion, did attempt by speaking directly with them. And, you know, that kind of diplomacy has to be resumed. I don't know if that's an answer, but, you know, we can't get China to do it for us.
Francine wants to know if you can explain what you mean by the new McCarthyism in academia.
Yes, and I'm afraid I can't recall the name of the exact program, but the FBI has undertaken a program to identify any American scholar who has received funds from any institution in China that might have ties to the Chinese military or the Chinese government. Now, you know, in China, virtually any academic institution or think tank has some ties to the Communist Party or to the military or something. And this may be pro forma in the nature of that society. So you could be getting a grant or have ties with or have had a visiting exchange program with a university in China or a think tank in China. And in the past, hundreds or thousands of American colleges and universities have had these kinds of exchanges, academic exchanges, scientific exchanges with Chinese institutions. Now, every single one of those exchanges are being investigated for their possible ties to the Chinese government authorities. And if you fail to reveal that, that's a crime. You could be criminalized. And scholars at MIT and Harvard have been arrested. And please, you know, I can't remember the precise details off the top of my head, but certainly a professor from MIT has been arrested because he failed to acknowledge in some form that one of the grants he received from a Chinese institution had some connection to some entity connected to the Chinese government. So now every professor or institution in America that ever had ties to anything in China is being investigated, and you could get in serious trouble. You could go to jail or fined if you fail to reveal that properly. So this is creating a paranoia in academia, and Chinese scholars their visas are being denied. People have come here year after year after year and no longer come here. American scholars can't go there, and if they do, they're under scrutiny. So that's what I mean by the new McCarthyism.
Is it possible to imagine a third party, such as the UN, offering to mediate the conflict? As Courtney listened to you talk, she would like to believe that an agreement could be reached for the sake of finding some mutual understanding.
I certainly wish that there were some way to bring these parties together. I don't think the UN, because UN the UN, by the UN, you know, we're talking about the Security Council. That's US, China, Britain, France, and Russia. And you know, that's not a place that where that's going to happen. One would hope that the countries of the Pacific that are going to be exposed to this war that I described, if it were to break out, are the ones that should intervene. The ASEAN nations, Japan, South Korea, the Philippines, that house American bases and therefore would be targets in a war. They're the ones that should intervene, but they all trade with China. And their economies are dependent on China, but they're tied militarily to the US. So they're the ones who should be bringing the two sides together and saying, we don't want to be caught up in a world war, you know, in a nuclear war between the two of you.
This question is from Andrew. It's a bit of a existential quandary. Could be a fun one. I believe I have personally benefited very little from American homogeny. Is that wrong? It seems American leadership positions in the world is a concern mostly among elites. Blinken has said, I have no idea why State Department, we have helped Walmart set up stores in India.
Well, that is a good question. There may be other people in this discussion who would have, you know, a different answer equally valid as mine. I do share the view that there is among American elite a belief in hegemony and dominance for its own sake. I would say that there may have been a time when, from a purely capitalistic point of view, that American, you know, imperialistic impulses benefited the country in some economistic fashion, but I don't think that's, if it was ever true, I don't think it's true anymore. But the impulses have not stopped. Let me give you an example. There was a time when the U.S. was heavily dependent on imported oil from the Middle East, and that made U.S. policymakers forge alliances with the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and other Middle Eastern potentates, kingdoms, and to be involved in wars there because it protected the flow of cheap oil, from which Americans benefited from that cheap oil, I suppose. Probably the cost of the war exceeded the benefits, but put that aside. But the US no longer is dependent on Middle Eastern oil, yet the American forces, the central command that was set up for that purpose is still there. And the impulse to intervene in Middle Eastern affairs has not gone away because of this compulsion to remain the dominant power and to exercise this power in Afghanistan, wherever you look. I think this is something that imperial powers never forget. Look at Russia with Putin wanting to recreate the Russian Empire. It's you know, the French Empire doesn't go away either. The French are intervening now in Africa. There's something about imperial elites that they can't let go of this. But that's my reading of history.
This is the last question that came my way. It's a long one, so I'm going to try and condense it and make it more palatable. It's from Laura, and she wanted to know if you had considered that while armed with China's illiberal and authoritarian government, groups like the Union of Concerned Scientists have argued that it will not translate into a comparable nuclear arms race in line with the Cold War, because China does not have that type of money to waste building on nuclear forces to the extent that some China hawks are predicting.
Could you repeat that?
Sure. She wanted to know if you would consider that while alarmed with China's illiberal and authoritarian government, groups like the
Union of Concerned Scientists.
yes, this group argues that it will not translate into a comparable nuclear arms race in line with the Cold War, because China does not have that type of money to waste building up its nuclear arms force.
Well, that's not true. China has all the money in the world to build up its nuclear forces as much as it wants. The fact is that China doesn't want to do that. And that's something that Americans need to hear. And I'm glad that that question was raised, because China has a policy, a nuclear policy of no first use and of strictly having nuclear weapons, it says, for the purpose of retaliation in case it's attacked. And so it has a very small nuclear arsenal. It's the size of France and Britain and Israel, India, Pakistan for that matter. And that's not because it lacks money. It has plenty of money. If it wanted to expand its arsenal, it could. It's just chosen not to. And I think American public needs to hear that. What we're going to hear instead, and I'm glad that question arose, is because we're going to hear from the hawks that China's on a wild scramble to expand its nuclear arsenal. And what's being claimed by American intelligence is over the next decade, they may increase the number of its warheads, nuclear warheads, from 200 to 400. Now, I think this is, awful, and I don't want to see a single more nuclear warhead built. But the US probably has 3,000 or 4,000 nuclear warheads, and Russia has at least that many. So the fact that they're going from 200 to 400 is not going to change. We're not going to be any more at risk than we were before. So we shouldn't panic, but we're going to hear a lot of panicking messages about that. But this is not because China lacks the capacity or the money. It's simply, it is putting its money into ships and ballistic missiles, and precisely for the reason that I gave, because they feel threatened by American aircraft carriers and those bases in Okinawa and Japan. And that's what they want to be able to destroy. So they're putting a lot of money into that.
Thank you so much. I had a couple people ask about the slide with the resources. I took a screenshot of it. Would it be okay if I shared that slide with our participants today?
What is it about?
I took a screenshot of the slide with your more resources. Would it be okay if I shared that with the group today?
Yeah.
Great. So for the people who would have asked, I will share that with you. That's all the questions that came through on my end. Thank you so much for your time and your expertise. It was very well attended and everybody has such wonderful things to say about it. So thank you so much, Michael.
Oh, okay. I'm so glad for those questions. And, you could, I would like to invite more comments on my presentation, because for the reasons I gave, I hope to be able to speak on these to other groups. And so if you have criticisms or suggestions, I would welcome them.
Sure.
And you could write to me at M for Michael Klare, Klare, at hampshire.edu. And I would welcome any feedback or criticisms that you have.